Mark was speaking, his voice dripping with that familiar, false sympathy, saying he just could not understand how this happened. He claimed the data was completely incoherent. He stood at the head of the main conference room, addressing our senior partner, Richard. On the massive screen was a presentation, a distorted, ugly, and frankly stupid version of my 3-month analysis for the Braxton client. The clients were sitting right there, looking confused and annoyed. Richard, however, looked furious. His gaze was fixed, not on the screen, but on me. Mark continued, playing the martyr to perfection. He explained that my project file on the shared server must have been corrupted overnight. He said he found it this morning. Shaking his head in theatrical sorrow, he claimed he stayed up all night. Literally all night, trying to salvage what he could. This, he explained, was the best he could do. He was positioning himself as the savior and me as the incompetent fool who almost lost the firm's biggest client. Richard's contemptuous look confirmed that the lie was working. The third party, the boss, had validated Mark's gaslighting. I remained silent. I did not fidget. I did not look down. I simply held Richard's glare. I felt nothing. No panic. No fear. No humiliation. Only a profound, cold contempt. Mark had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought he was sabotaging a colleague. He had no idea he was activating a trap. I let the silence stretch. I watched Mark's performance. He was a master of this. He was the cold actor, the man who feigns concern while plunging the knife. His entire strategy relied on his targets being too flustered, too embarrassed, or too weak to fight back in the moment. His arrogance was a shield. He needed to be the hero, the center of every crisis, and he was so addicted to that feeling. He had to create the crises himself. His fatal miscalculation was simple. He believed I was disorganized. He believed I was like everyone else, trusting our flimsy, unreliable shared server for my most important work. He believed I was stupid. He had characterized me as a scrappy but slightly overwhelmed colleague. And he, the mentor, was just trying to help me succeed. This mischaracterization was the central pillar of his strategy. He saw me as weak, and therefore, he saw me as prey. He was so certain of his victory that he performed this execution publicly. In front of the clients and the senior partner, he wanted witnesses to my failure and to his heroism. Richard finally spoke. His voice clipped and furious. He asked if I had anything to say for myself. His question was purely rhetorical. He had already convicted me. I thought back to my first year at the firm. I remembered the anxiety, the desperation to prove myself. Mark had mentored me then, too. He had helped me on the Harrison pitch. He took my raw data, polished it, and then presented it for me. He told everyone I was struggling but had good instincts. He received a bonus for his team leadership. I, Boer, on the other hand, received sympathetic looks in the hallway for being the intern who almost failed. I had been grateful for his help then. I was young, and I mistook his sabotage for kindness. But I was not young anymore. I had learned to see his help for what it was, a weapon, a tool he used to establish dominance, to keep others dependent, and to ensure he was always the most valuable person in the room. The moment I realized that, years ago, was the moment I stopped trusting the server. It was the moment I stopped trusting him. It was the moment I began building. So I met Richard's glare with cold silence. I gave Mark nothing. No tears. No excuses. No stammering defense. I let them both sit in the reality Mark had created, savoring the profound gap between what they believed was happening and what was actually happening. Mark thought he was ending my career. I knew he was ending his own. I ignored Richard's fuming. I ignored the client's awkward shuffling. I ignored Mark, who was still looking at me with that pathetic, practiced expression of concern, an expression he expected me to break against. I simply stood up. The scrape of my chair was the only sound in the room. I did not offer a defense. I did not engage with the accusation. I simply walked, slowly and deliberately, to the head of the table. Mark's eyes followed me, his smugness turning into a flicker of confusion. He had expected tears. Excuses. Ora desperate. Stammering apology. He had not expected this. He had not expected silence. I reached the podium. Mark was still logged in, his laptop connected to the main screen, displaying the wreckage of his salvage attempt. I placed my hand on his laptop connector. He flinched. I said nothing. I simply unplugged it. The screen went black. The clients gasped. Richard, who had been about to reprimand me for moving, froze. I reached into my bag and pulled out my own encrypted personal hard drive. A small, sleek, black device. I plugged it into the port. As the drive loaded, I finally allowed myself to savor the truth. This was the moment I had been planning for. The file on the server was not corrupted. It was a decoy. It was a honeypot I had planted 3 days ago. I knew Mark. I knew his psychological profile, as well as I knew my own. He is a predator. But he is a predator with a very specific, arrogant routine. He cannot stand to see someone else succeed. And his need to be the hero is a compulsion. So, I had crafted the decoy file with intentional, subtle flaws. The data on slide 12 was slightly miscalculated. The final summary on slide 30 was competent, but weak. It was just flawed enough to trigger his insufferable arrogance, to make him believe he could do it better, that he could save me. He did not find a problem. He took the bait. He had crept into the server late at night, seen my flawed work, and just as I predicted, he had deleted my file to replace it with his own. He needed to create the crisis, my deletion, so he could be the hero, his salvage. He never once considered that I would have an original. He never once considered that I was not as stupid as he was. The screen flickered. My presentation loaded. It was flawless. The branding was sharp. The data visualizations were interactive and brilliant. The 5-year projection was aggressive, innovative, and backed by unassailable logic. I watched the room. The clients, who had been checking their phones, suddenly sat up. One of them, the CEO, leaned forward, his eyes scanning the data. Richard, who had been red-faced with anger, was now pale with shock. His head swiveled from the brilliant screen to me, and then, finally, to Mark. And Mark, oh, Mark. His face was a picture of absolute destruction. The mask of concerned mentor dissolved. The smug sympathy evaporated, replaced by a gray, sickly confusion. He stared at the screen, then at me. He was processing the gap between his expectation, my utter humiliation, and the reality that his salvage was a child's drawing next to this, the real work. He understood, in that single, devastating instant, that he had not sabotaged me. He had been played. I clicked to the final slide and turned to face the room. I looked past the clients, past Richard, and settled my gaze on Mark. My voice was calm, cold, and just loud enough for everyone to hear. I told him I appreciated the effort, but I preferred the original. The presentation concluded. The clients were ecstatic. They loved the projections. They loved the strategy. And they were shaking my hand, their eyes bright with new business. They did not look at Mark once. When they had been escorted out by the junior associates, the heavy glass door of the conference room clicked shut, leaving just the 3 of us, me, Richard, and Mark. The silence was heavy, but the dynamics had shifted completely. Richard was no longer looking at me with contempt. His gaze, ice-cold and furious, was now locked onto Mark, the trigger for this new phase, the fallout from my presentation. was his simple, brutal question. He asked Mark what the hell just happened. Mark, who had been standing by the wall like a statue, flinched. The blood had not yet returned to his face. He was still pale, still processing his public execution. He stammered that he did not know. He insisted my file was corrupted. He swore that what he showed was what was on the server. He was trying to recover, to find a new angle. He looked at me. A new, desperate accusation in his eyes. He said I must have had two versions. He claimed I must have kept this other one hidden. He asked why I would do that. Why I would not use the shared server like everyone else. He was trying to paint me as the suspicious one. The one who was not a team player. It was a classic, hypocritical pivot. He was accusing me of the very secrecy he himself relied upon to commit his sabotage. I remained silent. I let him talk. I let him dig. I watched him flail. Watched him try to build a new narrative on the ashes of the old one. This was the second part of the trap. The first part exposed his incompetence. This part would expose his criminality. When Mark finally ran out of words, his accusations hanging in the air, I turned to Richard. My expression was not one of smugness or victory. It was one of calm, professional concern. I told Richard that Mark was right about one thing. This was a serious problem, but the file was not corrupted. I paused, letting the implication land. Mark looked up, confused. I continued, my voice steady. I explained that the file I put on the server was deleted. What Mark showed was something else entirely. And that, I stated, was a profound security breach. I had weaponized the system. I had used the firm's own language, its own panic points, against the saboteur. Richard's eyes narrowed. He was a shark. He smelled blood. He asked what I was suggesting. I suggested nothing. I stated facts. I said that to protect the integrity of this client's data, and to protect the firm, we must have IT pull the server access logs for that file immediately. We needed to see who the last user was before it was deleted. We needed to know who accessed it, and at what time. This was the kill shot. I did not have to accuse Mark. I did not have to mention his name. The system would do it for me. I watched Mark. It was a beautiful sight. The blood drained from his face again, leaving him a waxy, grayish white. His eyes widened. He knew, just as I knew, what those logs would show. They would show his IP address. They would show his user credentials. They would show the precise timestamp for the delete action, the action he took at 11 o'clock last night, just before he began his heroic all-night salvage. He had walked directly into the trap. He thought he was a crisis manager. He was just a common vandal. And vandals always get caught on tape. Richard looked at Mark's face, saw the guilt, and then looked at me. Seeing my cold calm for the first time, he nodded once. He picked up his phone and told his assistant to get IT in there. Now. It took less than 5 minutes. The IT administrator, a young man who looked terrified to be in the same room as a fuming Richard, simply displayed the server log on the main screen. There it was, inarguable. Mark's user ID, file path divided by projects divided by Braxton, divided by final analysis, decoy, action delete, timestamp 11:10, 2 p.m. Richard did not speak. He just stared at the screen. Mark looked from the screen to Richard, his face cycling through a grotesque spectrum of panic and rage. He finally broke. He screamed that this was ridiculous, that I set him up. He pointed at the file name on the screen, yelling that decoy proved I planted it, that this was entrapment, that I planned this. He was pointing at me. His face contorted. The cold actor was gone, replaced by the hot aggressor. The narcissistic rage was terrifying, but only to those who had never seen it before. I had seen it. I had been expecting it. This, too, was part of the calculation. Richard looked at Mark's screaming, pointing figure. And then at me. I was silent. Calm. Unmoving. The contrast was everything. In that moment, Richard did not see a setup. He saw a liability. He saw an unstable employee, Mark, admitting to destroying a file in front of a senior partner. After publicly humiliating the firm in front of a client, he saw a lawsuit. Richard's voice was dangerously quiet. He told Mark to get out. Mark froze, asking what he meant. Richard repeated himself. Get out. He ordered Mark to wait in his office and not to speak to anyone. Mark stared, his mouth open. But the rage had been shocked out of him, replaced by a cold, visible dread. He walked, stiff-legged, out of the conference room. Richard turned to me. He looked at the IT admin and told him to leave us. The admin scrambled out. Richard looked at me. His expression was not friendly. It was analytical. He was reassessing me, recalibrating his understanding of who I was. He stated that this was now a formal HR matter, and that I understood that. I just nodded. This was the trigger. The second domino, Mark's public explosion, combined with the undeniable proof of his sabotage, meant this could no longer be handled quietly. Richard, to protect the firm, had to escalate this. The system was now grinding forward, and Mark was caught in its gears. An hour later, I was in a sterile, white room with Sarah, the head of human resources. She was severe, professional, and had the eyes of a mortician. She asked me to recount the events of the presentation, which I did. Factual, cold, devoid of emotion. Then she paused, her pen hovering over her notepad. She asked if, in my opinion, this was a personal conflict, or something else. I let the silence sit. I knew what she was asking. I was being given an opportunity. This was the moment I could present the pattern. I met her gaze. I told her I did not believe in personal conflicts at work, but that I was concerned about a pattern. Sarah's eyes narrowed. She told me to go on. I recalled the Harrison pitch. From my first year, I mentioned how Mark had helped me. I mentioned David, in marketing, whose client presentation mysteriously failed to load 2 years ago, forcing Mark to step in and present the backup, a backup he had prepared. I mentioned Sarah in accounting, whose quarterly reports were misfiled just before the audit, a crisis Mark solved by finding them in the wrong directory. I was not accusing. I was simply providing data. I was highlighting a series of unfortunate crises where Mark and Fermansen, coincidentally, was always the savior. I was doing exactly what he had done to me for years. I was poisoning the well. But I was not using lies. I was using the truth. Sarah, the HR executive, listened to every word. She did not take copious notes. She just watched me. I watched her realize that this was not a one-time incident of sabotage. This was not a personal fight. This was serial fraud. She finally nodded. A single, sharp motion. She thanked me, saying that gave them a clear path for the investigation. As I left the room, I saw her pick up the phone. I heard her ask her assistant to get her David from marketing. The investigation was no longer about me and Mark. It was about Mark's entire career, and I had just handed them the list of witnesses. The HR investigation took 2 weeks. 2 weeks during which Mark was on paid administrative leave. He was not allowed in the building. He was, I am sure, at home, convincing himself that this was all a misunderstanding, that he could talk his way out of it, that I was the one in trouble for entrapment. He was, as always, miscalculating. He failed to understand that the system, once activated, is impersonal. HR is not about justice. It is about mitigating liability. And I had just shown them a massive liability. The HR report was a masterpiece of corporate understatement. It concluded that Mark's actions demonstrated a clear and repeated pattern of willful misconduct and a subversion of standard quality control protocols for personal gain. That last part, for personal gain, that was the trigger for the next Tadian. Beautiful domino. That was the financial kill shot. I thought back, savoring the memory, to the company-wide meeting last January. Richard was on stage, handing out the end-of-year bonuses, and he had created a special discretionary award, the Fireman Award. It was for the person who showed the most grit, the one who ran into the fire to save a client. Mark had won it. Of course he had. He had walked on stage to thunderous applause, shaking his head humbly. As if embarrassed by the attention, he accepted the crystal statue and the bonus check, a check for $50,000. I remembered watching him. I remembered the applause from David and from Sarah in accounting, the very people whose projects he had saved, the very crises he had manufactured. He was a social parasite. He was not just stealing credit. He was not just poisoning the well. He was cashing in. He was literally, tangibly profiting from his own sabotage. He had found a way to create a crisis, solve the crisis he created, and then get paid a hero bonus for his fraudulent act. It was the most arrogant, perfect grift. He believed he was a genius. He believed everyone else was just a supporting character in his story, a ladder for him to climb. He never once thought that the rungs on that ladder might remember being stepped on. That was his miscalculation. He saw all of us as individual, isolated victims. He never imagined we would become a pattern. The HR report turned his pattern into a legal classification fraud. I was in my office, a new, larger office, as Richard had already transferred the Braxton account to me when I saw the email from the legal department. It was a firm-wide memo. It announced that Mark was no longer an employee of this firm, effective immediately. This was standard, but I kept reading. I saw him, at that same moment, through my office window. He was being escorted out of the building by 2 security guards. He was not carrying a box of his belongings. He was just being walked out, his face pale and slack with shock. The legal memo continued. It stated that due to the findings of the HR investigation, his termination was for cause. I savored that phrase. For cause. It meant no severance, no golden parachute, no payout for his vested stock options. All of it gone. But the final sentence was the true masterpiece. It was the domino I had been waiting for. The memo stated that the firm had initiated civil proceedings to claw back all discretionary bonuses paid to him associated with the projects reviewed in the investigation. They were taking his money. All of it. The $50,000 from last year, the Fireman Award, the bonuses from the David Project, the Sarah Project, 5 years of fraudulent heroism. All of it converted. In an instant. From profit into debt. He was not just fired. He was ruined. For a week, the firm was quiet. The Mark problem seemed to be over. He was fired. He was being sued. And the office was already adapting to his absence. The air felt cleaner. People were collaborating more, no longer worried that their work would mysteriously develop problems. I was in Richard's office, walking him through the final rollout plan for the Braxton project. The transition had been seamless. The client was happy. Richard was happy. Everything was exactly as it should be. This was the part of the plan that required no action from me. It required only patience. I had surgically removed the tumor. Now, I was just watching the body heal. But I knew Mark, and I knew that a narcissist, when cornered, does not retreat. Escalates. His firing and financial ruin were not, in his mind, a consequence of his actions. They were an injustice, a betrayal. His narcissistic rage would be simmering. He would be sitting at home, stewing in his own hypocrisy, rewriting the entire narrative until he was the victim and I was the monster. His arrogance would not let him accept that I had defeated him with logic. He had to believe I had cheated, that I had set him up. And when a narcissist feels betrayed, his first and only impulse is revenge. He would try to hurt the firm, and he would definitely try to hurt me. His fatal miscalculation, as always, was his ego. He still believed he was the smartest man in the room. He still believed the clients were loyal to him. As if on cue, Richard's computer chimed. He glanced at an email that had just arrived. His eyes widened slightly. He looked at me, an expression of disbelief on his face. He said he had to be kidding him. He turned his monitor toward me. It was an email from Mr. Pervinestation. Braxton, the CEO of the client company. The subject line was, "An urgent warning." Braxton had written a curt note at the top. He stated that he was forwarding this to Richard as a professional courtesy. He called Mark's contact harassment. He confirmed they were, of course, staying with the firm because of my excellent work. He told Richard to handle this individual. And below it was the email from Mark. It was a masterpiece of self-destruction. A long, rambling, unhinged rant. He had written it directly to Braxton. He accused me of being a corporate saboteur. He accused me of planting evidence. He accused Richard of covering it up to protect a failed diversity hire. He painted himself as the real talent, the man who had actually tried to save the project from my incompetence. And then, the finale. He offered to rescue Braxton from our corrupt firm. He offered his services as a private consultant, promising he could deliver the project for half the cost. I had to stop myself from smiling. It was perfect. Mark's arrogance was so profound that he genuinely believed Braxton had been impressed by his heroic act in the boardroom. He thought the client would see him as the victim. He had miscalculated. He failed to understand that clients do not care about internal drama. They care about results. And the only result Braxton had been impressed by was my flawless, original presentation. Mark had just tried to poach the firm's biggest client. He had put his accusations against me. And against Richard. In writing, he had confessed, in his own words, to a direct attempt to harm the company. Richard looked at me. He said that Mark had just handed them the gun, the bullets, and a signed confession. I just nodded. My face, a mask of cold calm. I asked him what we do now. He picked up his phone. He told his assistant to get him legal. Now, the legal department moved faster than I had ever seen them move. Mark's email to Braxton was not just an act of petty revenge, it was a declaration of war. And worse, for him, it was a profound contractual breach. Richard, the legal team, and I were in a brief, cold meeting. The head of legal, a woman named Chen, was not emotional. She was, like me, analytical. She simply projected Mark's signed employment agreement onto the screen. She highlighted 2 clauses. The first was the non-solicitation clause. It explicitly forbade any employee, for a period of 24 months post-termination, from contacting any client of the firm with whom they had worked, for the purpose of luring that client away. The second, and more brutal, clause was the non-compete agreement. It was notoriously strict, a relic of the firm's older, more aggressive days. It barred a terminated employee from engaging in any business deemed competitive within the entire state. For 2 years. I remembered signing that contract. I remembered spending an entire weekend reading every line, understanding every trap, every obligation. I remembered Mark, on that same day, flicking through the pages and signing his name with a flourish. He had joked that only the grunts needed to read the fine print. His arrogance was a pre-existing condition. He truly believed that contracts, rules, and procedures were for other people. They were for the little people, the ones who were not rainmakers like him. He saw himself as an artist, a genius, a consultant, He failed to see that he was, at his core, just an employee. An employee who had signed a very very binding document. He had miscalculated. He thought his only relationship was with the client. He forgot his primary sin. Legal relationship was with the firm he had just tried to sabotage. Chen explained the strategy. The clawback suit was already in progress. That was for the money he stole. This was new. This was for the damage he was trying to do. She explained that they were not just adding this to the civil suit. They were filing for an emergency injunction. Richard nodded. Good. I savored that. An injunction. It was so much cleaner than suing for money. A lawsuit for damages could take years. An injunction, given the smoking gun email Mark had so helpfully provided, could be granted in days. An injunction was not a request. It was a court order. It was a legal stop sign, planted in the middle of his life. 2 days later, the news came. A judge had granted the temporary injunction. Pending a full hearing, Mark was now, by order of the court, legally forbidden from soliciting any of our clients. And more importantly, he was forbidden from working at all in the consulting industry. In any capacity. Within the state. He was not just fired. He was not just being sued. He was, as of that moment, professionally non-existent. The man who had built his entire identity on being the hero, the savior, the genius, was now legally barred from the one and only thing he knew how to do. He could not get a job with a competitor. He could not start his own firm. He could not even privately consult for Braxton. As his email had so arrogantly offered, he was, in the most complete and total sense, unemployable. I thought of him, sitting in his apartment, stewing in his rage. Now trapped. He had tried to put me in a box of incompetence. He had tried to sabotage my career. Now, because of his own uncontrollable ego, his own career was over. He had built a prison for me, and in his rage, he had locked himself inside it. The consulting world is, in reality, a very small town. News travels fast. It was one thing for Mark to be fired for, 'cause it was another for him to be sued for a clawback. But the injunction, that was a public declaration. It was a scarlet letter. The story was no longer just firm gossip. It was industry-wide news. The reason for the injunction, the attempted client poaching, the serial sabotage, the sheer, idiotic arrogance of his final email had spread to every rival, every headhunter, every senior partner in the city. Mark was not just unemployable, he was toxic. The true test, the final pillar of his life, was his social standing. This was the man who lived for the networking event, the cocktail hour, the industry gala. He had built his persona not just on being a hero at work, but on being the inside man in the community. He mentored juniors from rival firms. He shared insights with his peers. He cultivated a massive network of allies who all believed he was their friend, their confidante. He had miscalculated. As always, he mistook transactional relationships for loyalty. He believed these people, the ones he golfed with and drank with, would believe his version of the story. He would be the victim, the martyr, the brilliant mind brought down by a jealous, incompetent. That would be me, colleague. He believed his web of social allies would catch him. This miscalculation was on full display at the annual Consulting Leadership Gala. It was the premier event of the year. Black tie, champagne, the CEOs and senior partners of every major firm, all in one grand ballroom. I was there. No longer just a senior analyst, but as the new lead on the Braxton account, I was, for the first time, one of the people who mattered. And then I saw him. He was standing near the entrance, looking thin and pale in his tuxedo. He should not have been there. He was unemployed. He was toxic. His presence was an act of pure, Desperate ego. He could not accept that he was no longer part of this world. He was trying to play the part. He held a drink. He tried to smile. He saw a group of managing partners from 3 different rival firms. Men he used to call his inner circle. I watched. This was the part of the plan I had not even bothered to script. Because it was so beautifully, perfectly inevitable. Mark approached them, his hand half extended. A martyr story, no doubt, prepared on his lips. He started to speak. One of them, a man named Harris, looked up. His eyes registered Mark. There was no recognition, no friendship, just a flat, cold assessment. Harris did not speak. He did not even nod. He simply, and very deliberately, turned his back to Mark. The second man, seeing Harris, did the same. He turned to speak to the third, physically closing the circle. Mark was left standing outside the group, his hand still awkwardly raised. He had been socially executed in less than 3 seconds. I savored it. Mark's entire strategy poisoning the well. Corrupting allies required allies. His cowardice required proxies. He had just discovered he had neither. These men were not his friends. They were sharks. And they smelled blood. They were not turning away because they found his actions morally repugnant. They were turning away because he was caught. He was a loser. He had no value, no power, and was a known liability. To be seen talking to him was a bad investment. He stood there, alone, in the middle of a room of 500 people. He scanned the crowd, looking for a friendly face. He found none. He found only my eyes. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just held his gaze. I watched him understand. He had lost his job. He had lost his money. He had lost his future. And now, he had lost his past. His entire social network. The thing he had spent 20 years building had evaporated. He was in exile. He put his drink down on a passing tray and, for the first time, he looked truly defeated. He walked out of the ballroom. Alone. I was working late in my new office. It had been Mark's. It was spacious. On the corner, with a view of the city lights. I was finalizing the implementation schedule for the Braxton project. The work was complex, but it was clean. There was no drama. No sabotage. Just the work. My computer chimed. A new email. It was 3:15 in the morning. The sender was Mark. Using his personal account. I leaned back in my chair. I took a slow sip of my tea. This was it. This was the inevitable implosion. He had lost his job. He had lost his money. He had lost his ability to work. And, after the gala, he had lost his social armor. He was naked. And this was the only thing he had left. The subject line was just one word. You. I opened it. It was not a short email. It was a torrent. A long, rambling, incoherent sermon of narcissistic rage. He wrote that I was the saboteur, that I was the monster. He called me inhuman, cold, calculating. He accused me of destroying his life, his reputation, all because I was jealous of his talent. He wrote that he had tried to mentor me, that he had covered for my mistakes for years, that his salvaging of my file was an act of kindness, an attempt to save me from my own incompetence. He accused me of entrapment, of spitting on the hand that fed me. He wrote that I would never be respected, that I had cheated my way to the top, that I was a cancer in the firm, and that I would, one day, get what I deserved. I read every word. I read them twice. I felt nothing. No guilt. No fear. Not even anger. I savored the irony. He was, for the first time, partially right. I was cold. I was calculating. He had finally, at the very end, seen me correctly. But his arrogance, his impenetrable ego, still forced him to misinterpret the motive. He called it jealousy. He had to call it jealousy, because the alternative was unacceptable to him. The alternative was that he was the inferior one. The alternative was that he was the reckless, arrogant fool, and I was the disciplined, intelligent professional. This email was not an attack. It was his final, pathetic confession. He was a complete hypocrite, accusing me of the exact sins he had committed. He was the saboteur. He was the monster who fed on the insecurities of others. He was the one who had tried to destroy a career out of petty arrogance. This email proved, in his own unhinged words, that he was utterly incapable of self-reflection. He could lose his job, his money, his future, and his entire social network, and still see himself as the victim. He proved that my decoy file was not an act of aggression. It was an act of necessity. It was the only language a man like him could ever understand. This email, this final, desperate scream into the void, was the validation of my entire strategy. He was confirming his own diagnosis. I read the final line of his email, where he accused me of ruining him. I considered it. I had not ruined him. I had merely given him the rope. He, in his desperate need to be the hero, had tied his own noose. I had simply stepped aside and allowed him to hang himself with his own ego. I took another sip of tea. The email was a liability. Not for me. For him, it was harassment. It was proof of his instability. It was the last domino. I did not delete it. I saved it. I attached it to a new, clean draft. I knew exactly who to send it to. I did not reply to his email. I did not block him. I simply forwarded it. My two-line included two names, Sarah, from Human Resources, and Chen, from Legal. My own note, typed below the forwarded rant, was brief, cold, and professional. I stated that this was for their records, that it was unwelcome and harassing contact, and that I requested all future communication to cease. I hit send. It was 3:20 in the morning. I shut down my computer, collected my things, and walked out of my new office. I knew what I had just done. I had set the final domino. The email from Mark was not just the pathetic cry of a broken man. It was a legal document. It was proof of instability. It was evidence of harassment. And in a firm as large as ours, a firm terrified of lawsuits, HR and legal had a non-negotiable duty to protect their employees from a hostile environment. Mark, in his final, idiotic act of rage, had just defined himself as a hostile environment. I had not asked for his destruction. I had merely created the conditions for his self-destruction. I planted a decoy file, knowing his arrogance would make him take the bait. The rest, the IT logs, the HR investigation, the clawback, the poaching attempt, the injunction, the social exile, all of it was a direct, logical, and inevitable consequence of his own choices, his own ego, his own uncontrollable rage. And this was the last logical consequence. A few days later, I was told that a process server had visited Mark's apartment. He was served with a temporary restraining order, filed by the firm's counsel on my behalf. I savored that thought. The man who saw himself as a hero was now legally designated a harasser. The man who built his career on saving people was now legally barred from coming within 500 feet of the building. The man who saw me as an incompetent, struggling junior was now legally forbidden from speaking, emailing, or even mentioning my name to any employee of the firm. He was not just fired, swed, and unemployable. He was, in the eyes of the law, a threat. It was the final, complete annihilation of his martyr persona. There was no one left to lie to. That afternoon, Richard called me into his office, the same room where, only weeks ago, He had looked at me with such profound contempt. Today, his expression was one of pure, cold respect. He said the Braxton implementation was flawless. He pushed a thick document across the polished desk. He told me the board had approved it, that they were impressed. I looked at the document. It was a new employment agreement. My name was at the top. The title, printed in bold, was senior partner. I noted that it was Mark's old job. Richard confirmed it was Mark's old job. But, he added, a new office. The corner one was mine. He said that it seemed he had misjudged my capabilities. He looked me in the eye, saying they needed someone who sees the whole board. I took the pen. I thought about Mark, sitting in his apartment, surrounded by the legal wreckage of his life. He had miscalculated. He thought he was the player and I was the pawn. He thought he was playing chess. He never understood that I was the one who had built the entire board. I signed my name. I walked to my new office, the real corner office, the one with the panoramic view of the city. I looked out the window. My decoy file had not just been a shield. It had been a key. It had not just saved me from his sabotage. It had given me everything he had ever tried to steal. There was no smile. There was no celebration. There was just the cold, satisfying, and perfect quiet. The quiet of a problem solved. The quiet of a long overdue bill, finally paid in full.